Hello, I'm Abram Vanningen.
And I'm Joanne Diaz.
And this is Poetry for All.
So, Abram, are you getting your stack of poetry books ready for the month of August? Do you know what's happening in the month of August?
What is happening in the month of August?
The Seeley Challenge. Do you know what the Seeley Challenge is?
Tell me about the Seeley Challenge.
So Nicole Seeley, who is a wonderful poet, she sort of posited this challenge on social media, that during the month of August, she challenged everyone to read one book of poetry per day and to share the experience on social media. So any of you, it's very simple. Even if you're not connected to social media, it doesn't matter. Now's the time. Order a bunch of books from your library, maybe browse a few at your local bookstore, and try to read a book of poems per day. And when you hear that, you're thinking, my God, I haven't read a book all year. How am I going to read a book a day? Here's the great thing about books of poetry. Many of them are rather slim. It's a wonderful opportunity to maybe re-engage with a poet that you love and maybe you haven't read their newest book, or maybe it's a chance to read a brand new poet. I know that for us, as we prepare for another year of podcasting, it's a very generative month because we encounter poets that maybe we've never heard of before, and sometimes they end up on this podcast. So I just wanted to give a plug for that.
That's so awesome. You know why I love this?
No.
When you tell people to read poetry, sometimes they don't know what that means or how to do it. And the great thing about the Seeley Challenge is you just read it. Like you read it cover to cover. And the whole thing about poetry is you can actually do that in a day. You could do that in an afternoon. You could do that in less than an afternoon.
I think that's right. And maybe the poet that we discussed today could be at the top of everyone's list. Diane Seuss. Abram, would you be willing to read this poem for us?
Absolutely. The sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do without. To have, as my mother says, a wish in one hand and shit in another. That was an answer to a wish I had, an Instamatic camera and a father. Wish in one hand, she said, shit in another. She still says it. When she tells me she wishes I were there to have some of her bean soup, she answers herself. Wish in one hand, she says, shit in another. Poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher. The kind that raps your knuckles with a ruler, but not the kind that throws a dictionary across the room and hits you in the brain with all the words that ever were. Boxed fathers buried deep are still fathers, teacher says. Do without the, without and, without hot dogs in your baked beans. A sonnet is a mother, every word a silver dollar. Shit in one hand, she says, wish in another.
Oh, that was a good reading. I love this poem so much.
I love this poem so much, too.
Well, should we say a bit about who Diane Seuss is?
Yeah, who is Diane Seuss? And where does this poem appear?
So this is from her book titled Frank, Sonnets, right? So I don't know. I don't think I'm alone in saying this. It's one of the best poetry books of the 21st century. I mean, it came out a couple years ago, and when it did, it won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, many other accolades. And of course, she's the author of many other books as well. But why did this book, Frank, Sonnets, why did it earn so many accolades? I think it's because it does what the title of the book promises. Like, it is frank, it is honest, it is direct, it confronts grief and illness in ways that are utterly disarming. Seuss's father died when she was young. Many of the poems directly engage with the loss of a dear friend who died of AIDS. Many of the poems grapple with addiction, and as is the case with this poem that you just read, with really difficult circumstances, financial circumstances, right? I love it. It's such a powerful poem.
Yeah, so let's get into it right from the beginning. This first line, which I find so striking. So I'm just going to read the first line, not the first sentence.
Okay.
The sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do. The first sentence is, the sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do without. And so you get immediately from the beginning this powerful sense of a line break. And, it's just worth saying again that lines are these units of thought that also oftentimes embed a kind of surprise at the end. You don't necessarily stop your reading at the end of a line, but nonetheless, the movement from one end of the line to the next produces a kind of pause, even mentally. And in this poem, we see that she uses line breaks frequently to cause a kind of surprise and a shift or a transformation or a transition that you sort of didn't see coming. Even in the second line, to have, as my mother says, a wish in one hand, that's where it ends. And then the next line says, and shit in another, right? So these surprises that she builds into the line breaks are just really well done.
Well, and look at what she's yoking together. First of all, I'll go back even to a smaller unit, the sonnet, like poverty. So you have those inside sounds, on it, poverty, right? That sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do without. Now, what interests me about that is, especially in the 21st century, if you ask a free verse poet to write a sonnet, they may not think, or most people are like, oh God, it's going to teach me what I can't do. It's a poetic form that is about constraint and restraint, right? But she's saying so what she's saying is actually counterintuitive. The sonnet teaches you what you can do, and so does poverty. And again, that's counterintuitive. Poverty sounds like a limitation, but in the world of this poem and the other poems that surround it in the book, poverty is a teacher. It teaches you what you can do without. And that's really important because I feel like that's her goal through so many of these poems, is to turn whatever assumptions a reader might have on their head. It's really, really powerful. And doing that just with a very simple, very well chosen line break. Beautiful.
One of the common themes that you get from the first line all the way through this poem is this idea of pedagogy, education, teaching.
Yes.
What teaches you what? And in this case, she's learning something from this phrase that her mother keeps using. And the phrase is a wish in one hand and shit in another. And what's interesting about that phrase is that it is itself somewhat poetic, right? Like the words almost rhyme, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to come to that later, but I think there's a way in which she's learning a kind of poetry from the phrases of her mother. My own grandma had this line that we always had in our family. My grandma had an 8th grade education, and my father ended up a medievalist at Notre Dame. So she had no idea what academic life was like. She just thought it looked pretty good. And so she always said to us about my father, your dad always lands with his ass in the butter. My grandma grew up on a farm. And I don't exactly know if I guess that's a good thing. You should probably want to land with your ass in the butter, I guess. But that was what she always said about my dad. And then, of course, when I went into academia, lo and behold, I had landed with my ass in the butter.
Yes, you did. Yes, it's wonderful.
But you have these lines that are just so particular and so just like, that was her line. That was always the line you got.
My dad has 1,000 different sayings that are not coming to mind for me right now. But
I'll tell you one of your dad's sayings because
Which
you
one?
say it every time we start this podcast.
What is it?
You say, well, I've got my belt and suspenders on.
He does. He has several about, he says always wear your belt and your suspenders. That's a good one. As far as what your grandmother and my dad could probably have an interesting conversation. My dad had a similar educational experience. He dropped out of high school, and I was the first in my family to go to college. And so whenever I'm at home, he'll ask me to do some little thing that's like a simple thing, like figuring out the remote. And after I do it, he'll say, "You can't beat a college education." But it's always something that has nothing to do with what you would learn in college, though. He's just trying to get my goat. You know what I mean? Because I landed in the butter. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
All right, so let's get back to this phrase. A wish in one hand and shit in another. One of the things that you're going to see in this poem and throughout this book is what does it mean to be taught this phrase out of these circumstances. The phrase is tied to the circumstances. And the circumstances are one of doing without, right? So on the one hand, you get this incredible line. That was an answer to a wish I had. And here again, you get this surprise. But this time it's a surprise of juxtaposition.
Oh, yeah.
An instamatic camera, and a father. And it's the first place you see, 4 lines into the poem that we're dealing with some really hard issues here. It's not just about, wanting a camera or something like that.
Yeah.
It's about wanting a father.
Yeah.
And that's when she says, wish in one hand, shit in another. And you get the sense that this is a family that is not only done without a father, but is done without so many things. And this is in a certain sense her education.
That's absolutely right. And that, again, that she's yoking 2 things together that don't seem like they would go together, which is a small object of the 20th century, an instamatic camera, which was such a mid-century, 20th century novelty, right? To have a camera that would instantly take a picture, and a father, which is relational and familial, and to have that loss as a child, and to want all kinds of things, and to just not be able to have them. And so for the mother to have this as a kind of refrain, wish in one hand, shit in another, to have that as a refrain that is repeated again and again through the speaker's childhood, and then up through to the present day, is very powerful, because it means that juxtaposition between wish and shit has never gone away.
Also, you get that feeling of the repetitions in this poem are about her mother still saying it today. I once saw a definition of poetry as repetition with variation. I don't know if that really works, but that phrase of her mom's comes up 3 times just the way her mom says it, and then a 4th time at the very end with some variation. And I think that's really important to get to that variation. How do we get to that variation? So we're headed there next, but the next time the line comes up is when the mother actually wants to have bean soup with her child. Tell me what you see in those lines.
When she tells me she wishes I were there to have some of her bean soup, she answers herself. Wish in one hand, she says, shit in another. What's happening in those sentences is it's implied that the poetic speaker is saying, no, I can't have soup with you tonight. So she doesn't directly say it, but the mother's answer indicates that it's an answer that will disappoint the mother, right? But also it's bean soup, right? It's not filet mignon. This is the most inexpensive meal that the mother could possibly eat. And that's really important. And then beans actually come back later in the poem in a different meal. Hot dogs and your baked beans, right? So again, the most elemental, simple, affordable foods possible.
And then I love what happens next, because the first half of this poem, the poem is really split in half almost perfectly. First half of this poem is the sonnet like poverty. And then the next 6 lines are really, what is it like to live in poverty? And that tells you what sonnets are like. Now, in line 8, exactly halfway through the poem, poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher. So you get the same comparison, but now it's reversed. And so the next couple lines are going to be about, what do sonnets do? How do they teach us? And how does that also kind of give us a window into what poverty is like? And so we get poverty like a sonnet is a good teacher, the kind that wraps your knuckles with a ruler, but not the kind that throws a dictionary across the room and hits you in the brain with all the words that ever were. That's the longest sentence in this sonnet. What do you see happening in that sentence?
What you said about returning with a variation, I think that's right on. Not just for this sonnet in particular, but for all of the sonnets in her book titled Frank, right? It's a sonnet sequence. I just want to be clear about that with our readers who may not have encountered the book before. It is a sonnet sequence of 100 some odd poems. So, and she returns to these key problems again and again of poverty, of addiction, of illness, of grief, of all kinds of difficulty. And it's really interesting to see how she picks up on this idea of what teaches us what, right? So poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher. Again, it's counterintuitive. And I should say too, that it's picking up on very old ideas and pieces of commonplace wisdom. And I didn't really think about this until I was in I went to a conference. It's called the Shakespeare Association of America. And there was a wonderful paper by Joel Dodson. He teaches at Southern Connecticut State University. And he pointed to this, and I hadn't seen it before, so I just want to give credit where credit is due. He mentioned that these lines about poverty being a teacher, they have a long history. Shakespeare has a sonnet that talks about poverty as a kind of teacher. And in his case, he's talking about poverty of poetry, which is a lack of creativity. And then Erasmus, who is a great humanist, he has this collection of Greek and Latin proverbs. Some of the proverbs say things like, need is a teacher, or need taught him wit, right? So she's drawing upon this really big idea that has had ripple effects throughout literary history. But let's go back to what she says. Poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher. If it's not the kind of teacher that hits you on the head with a book, but it is the kind of teacher that raps you on the knuckles, what does that suggest to you?
It suggests to me the necessities of constraint, right? So you don't get all the words that ever were. You only get a few words. But it's because you only get a few words that you've got to know what to do with them. And so if you use the wrong word, you're going to get rapped on the knuckles because now you've used up the space poorly. And you were saying before this podcast started, which I think is totally fascinating, even sonnets themselves, apart from that Erasmus and Shakespeare, they have this long association with patronage, with poverty, with where money goes. Like sonnets themselves kind of owe themselves, their very form, their very existence, to the idea of a moneyed elite that has the time and the resources to write things like sonnets.
Wow. Okay, so that's, I was just on, I was going to say Twitter, X, whatever it's calling itself. There was there was a poet writing on that platform, and, she asked a simple question, which is, why don't poets talk about money? Why don't they write poems about money? Why don't they write about the fact that they have money or can afford time to write poems? Where is that conversation? And I was like, I am here for that conversation.
Yeah.
That is it. That is everything. So anytime you read a poem that isn't ostensibly about money, where's the money? Follow the money, as they say in The Wire, right? And that's important. So let's start. If you think about Petrarch, the great humanist who innovated the sonnet form, you think about the great adopters of the form in English, Wyatt, Surrey, Spenser, all these guys. These were gentlemen, right, of the court who had an abundance of money. They were completely attached to power structures and political structures. Then within just a few decades, you end up with somebody like William Shakespeare, who's the son of a glove maker, a tradesperson, and who, moves to London. He makes it rich by being a stockholder in a theater company, and he writes his poems with the money of a patron. So every single one of those poems is paid for, okay? And I feel like her putting questions of money or lack of money at the front of this poem is absolutely just a boss move. It makes you then, it makes you then look back to all the sonnets that you didn't look at through that lens before, and it makes you ask important questions about money and labor. Very interesting.
Yeah. All right, so we come towards the end of the poem, but one of the things that happens next after that line is we get this line: boxed fathers buried deep are still fathers, teacher says. Like the first part of the poem, where you're surprised by the presence and absence of the father, right? She wants a father, there isn't a father there. In the second half of the poem, where we're thinking about poverty, we're thinking about sonnets and rulers and dictionaries and teaching, and suddenly the father enters and surprises you again. Except that boxed fathers, which again is about her father's death, it's about coffins, right? A father buried deep in a coffin, a boxed father. But boxed fathers are also fathers contained within the box of a sonnet. Because sonnets basically look like little boxes.
That's right.
Just what so many of the boxes, the sonnets of this book are about the grief for her father.
That's beautiful. And look what happens next. Again, repetition in this poem is masterful. Do without the, without and, without hot dogs in your baked beans. without. What do you make of the repetition in those very short 3 sentences back to back?
Especially when you're dealing with a sonnet, where every word has to count precisely because of the constraint she's been talking about. She is cutting away.
Yeah.
She's cutting away thes and ands. And then she returns to the idea of poverty. She's cutting away hot dogs and baked beans, right? It's all without, and it's all education. And then you come to this incredible last 2 lines. It's really a line and a half, which I take to be a kind of Shakespearean couplet. It's the turn at the end that surprises you and makes things new. And what she says next is, a sonnet is a mother. Now, wait a second. The first line is sonnet like poverty. The 8th line is poverty like a sonnet. And now at the very end, those are both similes, right? Then at the very end, a sonnet is a mother. Now we have a metaphor. It's very different. And the mother is the one who both is the one who's been saying this thing repeated through the poems. She's also the one who's been educating her daughter through a life of poverty. And then you get this next line, which is again a kind of surprise. Every word, a silver dollar. It's almost like the first line in the poem where you see real worth. It's because things are without, because they're rare, that they're worth so much. Every word, a silver dollar. And the last line of the poem is the repetition, but now a variation. Instead of wish in one hand and shit in another, we get it in reverse. Shit in one hand, she says, wish in another. We end on the wish. And it's almost as though, I read this poem almost as though a sort of hard-bitten gratitude poem for her mother. I'm basically saying all the poetry I have comes through the life that my mother taught me and raised me in, even her own poetic phrases.
That is amazing, and I love the final word of the poem because it suggests another, not just another hand, but another poem. It's a word that links or yokes to the next poem that will follow it. It's very generative, right? And I really love what you say about how you identify the turn or volta of this poem as the last line and a half, because I was kind of trying to figure out where it was, but like you say, that's a beautiful reading. I like that a lot.
So with all we've learned about this poem, would you be willing to read it again?
Oh, I love it, yeah. The sonnet, like poverty, teaches you what you can do without. To have, as my mother says, a wish in one hand and shit in another. That was in answer to, I wish I had an Instamatic camera and a father. Wish in one hand, she said, shit in another. She still says it. When she tells me she wishes I were there to have some of her bean soup, she answers herself. Wish in one hand, she says, shit in another. Poverty, like a sonnet, is a good teacher. The kind that raps your knuckles with a ruler, but not the kind that throws a dictionary across the room and hits you in the brain with all the words that ever were. Boxed fathers buried deep are still fathers, teacher says. Do without the, without and, without hot dogs in your baked beans. A sonnet is a mother. Every word a silver dollar. Shit in one hand, she says. Wish in another.
Oh, that's a great reading.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
I love this poem.
Thank you.
Oh.
I love this poem too. Thanks for that. And thank you to Graywolf Press for granting us permission to read this poem, which you'll find in a book titled Frank Sonnets, which you can read in the Seeley Challenge. If you'd like to learn more about Diane Seuss, you can visit her website and ours.
And we hope you like what you heard today. If you did, we hope you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing.
Please be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thank you.